Thank you for joining us for our series dedicated to the 2014 Standards for Accreditation. As part of their membership, Middle States accredited institutions must demonstrate that they meet or exceed the expectations for academic and institutional integrity and quality promoted through the 2014 Standards for Accreditation and Requirements of Affiliation. This module will share the expectations relating to Standard 4, Support of the Student Experience. After viewing this video, we hope that you will become familiar with the 2014 Standards for Accreditation, be able to assess institutional compliance using the criteria from Standard 4, understand what documentation will be useful in demonstrating compliance with Standard 4, be able to articulate the role of assessment as it relates to Standard 4, better understand the Commission's requirements of affiliation and how they relate to Standard 4. While the Commission has many relevant resources to assist you and your colleagues with demonstrating compliance with the standards and requirements of affiliation, the focus of this presentation will come from the Commission's publication, Standards for Accreditation and Requirements of Affiliation, the 13th edition. You can find this on the Commission's website and download a PDF version if you do not have a hard copy. This presentation will focus on Standard 4, which you can find by turning to page 9. In total, the process for ensuring compliance relies on a determination that an institution has demonstrated that it's in compliance with the Commission's 15 requirements of affiliation and 7 standards for accreditation. Compliance with both the requirements of affiliation and standards for accreditation is expected to be continuous. Institutions are, in most instances, comprehensively evaluated on both the requirements of affiliation and standards for accreditation at the time of their self-study evaluation. Institutions will be evaluated according to the requirements, standards, and their criteria within the context of institutional mission. This slide lists the Commission's 15 requirements of affiliation. Note that 2 of the requirements in particular, number 8, systematic evaluation of all programs, and number 10, institutional planning, are directly related to Standard 4. Some requirements of affiliation will be addressed within the self-study document, while others may be addressed through some other compliance mechanism. This slide provides you with one recommended approach for aligning the requirements of affiliation likely to be addressed in the self-study document with the appropriate standards. This is one approach of many. However, the appropriate linkages are made between requirements of affiliation and the standards. Put another way, institutions can and will address various requirements of affiliation in the self-study report as this chart demonstrates. Institutions endeavoring to demonstrate compliance with requirements of affiliation 8 and 10 can do so successfully by addressing them partially in a well-written, analytically based self-study section that addresses Standard 4. Let's take a closer look at requirements number 8 and 10. Requirement of Affiliation number 8 states that accredited institutions must engage in systematic evaluation of educational and other programs. Requirement of Affiliation number 10 communicates the Commission's expectation that institutional planning include a consideration of student achievement of educational goals, student learning, and the results of academic and institutional assessment. Consistent with the guiding principles of the Commission, mission-centeredness, student learning, innovation, and continuous improvement, it's important to note that both the requirements of affiliation and standards for accreditation stress that institutions are expected to demonstrate that they engage in assessment processes that regularly inform continuous quality improvement, overall institutional effectiveness, and the effective management of student learning. Institutions will need to include within their self-study materials how the criteria within each standard is met, as well as how the relevant requirements of affiliation are also met. It's important to remember, however, that when an institution demonstrates that it meets Standard 4, it must also demonstrate how it complies with the relevant requirements of affiliation. This may or may not require a separate analysis within the self-study document, but a clear indicator addressing the appropriate requirements of affiliation will be necessary. Some institutions have provided headings that include references to specific requirements of affiliation, or have footnoted or offset notations in the margins of the self-study document to indicate that the analysis provided also speaks to and demonstrates compliance with the appropriate requirement of affiliation. While the Commission is not prescriptive in terms of how compliance is documented, institutions have to be mindful of the appropriate alignment of the requirements of affiliation with the standards and clearly indicate to the evaluation team where that has been satisfied in the self-study document. Accompanying and consistent with the requirements of affiliation are the Commission's standards for accreditation. Let's review the language and criteria of Standard 4. Standard 4. Support of the student experience. Across all educational experiences, settings, levels, and instructional modalities, the institution recruits and admits students whose interests, abilities, experiences, and goals are congruent with its mission and educational offerings. The institution commits to student retention, persistence, completion, and success through a coherent and effective support system sustained by qualified professionals, which enhances the quality of the learning environment, contributes to the educational experience, and fosters student success. The student is the primary beneficiary of an institution's educational mission, and the success of an institution is best measured by the success of its students during and after their enrollment in an institution's programs. Admissions criteria and practices remain important elements in promoting student retention and access, and analysis of relevant data should inform the review and assessment of admission policies, procedures, and processes. Several points are worth noting. The standard emphasizes all settings and all modalities. The standard emphasizes policies, procedures, processes, and programs. The standard emphasizes students through their life cycle with an institution. The standard emphasizes institutional mission. And finally, the standard emphasizes the quality of the learning environment and student success. In what follows, the various criteria that constitute Standard 4 will be explained. This standard has a total of 6 criteria, which are noted on this and the next slide in general terms. As you review the criteria, you and your colleagues should be thinking about resources that are available at the institution that could be relied upon to demonstrate compliance with each criterion. These can be policies, procedures, or other types of evidence that would demonstrate during review that the institution meets the criteria. Criteria 1 through 3 cover policies and procedures around admissions, retention, transfer, the awarding of credits, and the maintenance of student records. Criteria 4 through 6 cover policies and procedures relating to student life and athletics, institutional renew and approval, and the periodic assessment of the effectiveness of the programs that support the student experience. These slides have highlighted the 6 criteria embedded within Standard 4. Now we will look at each one more closely. Criterion 1 requires institutions to have clearly stated policies and processes for admission and retention, as well as to facilitate student success. This criterion also speaks to institutional goals relating to admissions, enrollment, retention, completion, transfer rates, or other goals of importance to the institution. Utilizing data and determining courses of action to improve in those areas the institution has identified as important will be critical within this criterion, along with meeting federal expectations for compliance, which will also be discussed since those areas are captured within this standard's criteria. Demonstrating how the institution meets this standard includes providing information about expenses and financial support that the college or university has available to prospective and current students. These must be clearly articulated and available to the students. Each institution must have consumer information available to students. Institutions will share this information with the Commission through self-study and other mechanisms, for example, the compliance report or annual reporting. You should notice that there is also a natural link back to Standard 2, Ethics and Integrity, Criterion 7, which refers to the following as appropriate to mission: promoting affordability and accessibility, and enabling students to understand funding sources and options, value received for cost, and methods to make informed decisions about incurring debt. In addition, institutions can consider how successful they are in providing financial assistance to students, setting measures that are appropriate for internal analysis. In thinking about the institution's practices regarding admissions, for those students who are admitted but do not meet the standards for the level of study in their program, institutions must have a process to identify, place, and support students in their remediation as they work toward the program's required level of study. Ask yourselves, what support does the institution provide to at-risk students, and how effective are those mechanisms of support? Policies and processes relating to orientation, advisement, and counseling programs are also relevant under this criterion. What does the institution have in place to support the educational experience for the students? What changes have they made with regard to any of these programs, and why? How do they know that they are achieving the results they intended through their orientation, advising, and counseling approaches? Institutions should think about and identify other processes that have been implemented to further the success of students, those that might be unique to the institution, as those too would be relevant under Criterion 1. How have services for students expanded and been integrated into relevant policies and processes? What have assessment results revealed, and what shifts have been made to promote student achievement of their educational goals? Since periodic assessment is the final criterion of every standard, we will circle back to this question as we near the end of the review of the criteria. For Criterion 2, there are several questions for institutions to consider. For example, what policies and procedures guide the awarding of credit at the institution, and how are those evaluated regularly? How are those made available and clear to the students? Are any improvements needed in these areas? And with regard to experiential learning and other types of alternative approaches, how effectively does the institution assure that credit granted is warranted, defensible, and consistently applied? The Middle States Commission on Higher Education, in its role as a federally recognized accreditor, must confirm that an institution has transfer of credit policies that are publicly disclosed and include a statement of criteria established by the institution regarding the transfer of credit earned at another institution of higher education. As part of the Middle States Compliance Review, the Commission confirms policies and procedures are in place, public disclosures, identification of the office responsible for the final determination of acceptance or denial of credit, and a published and accessible list of institutions with which the institution has established articulation agreements. Since this represents an area of federal regulation, the Commission hosts webinars on compliance. You and your colleagues can take advantage of those as they are offered. More information is available on the Commission's website. In addition to the criteria included within this standard, Middle States also has a policy on transfer credit, prior learning, and articulation. That policy reiterates the expectation of the Commission as well as the requirements of federal regulation. The Middle States policy includes general principles relating to credit. A few highlights from those general principles include: transfer and experiential learning decisions are student-centered, striving for appropriate balance among fairness, consistency, flexibility, good educational practice, and academic program integrity. They address the needs of a student who has changed institutions or objectives, or has learned in non-traditional formats. Institutional mission and goals guide the formulation of policies and procedures for transfer and experiential learning. The basic principles of the institution regarding credit for prior learning are clear. The acceptance or denial of transfer credit is not determined exclusively on the basis of accreditation of the sending institution or the mode of delivery, but rather will consider course equivalencies, including expected learning outcomes, with those of the receiving institution's curricula and standards. Faculty participate in the creation, review, and implementation of transfer and experiential learning policies and procedures, and they advise both incoming and outgoing transfer students and experiential learning students. Evaluation of transcripts and experiential learning are conducted in a timely manner in order to be informative in academic advising and decision-making. Appropriate counseling, including any impact on financial aid eligibility by well-informed faculty and other support services are available. Again, as you review each criterion, You should be thinking about what policies and procedures or other documentation the institution has to demonstrate compliance with the standards as well as with federal regulations. You should also be identifying how and when the institution assesses or reviews those, and what changes have resulted from their assessment. Criterion 3 is interested in the protection of students' information and records. This can include several types of information that your institution is required to protect. One example would be the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, or FERPA, which is a federal law that protects the privacy of student records. As institutions examine Criterion 3, they want to determine how effective, well understood, and consistently implemented are the procedures and policies relative to the privacy of student information. Institutions should consider how often these policies and procedures are reviewed and what changes result from the assessment of the effectiveness of FERPA policies and procedures. However, this can extend beyond FERPA to other types of records that the institutions require from students and that they are entrusted to protect. This also represents an area of overlap with federal compliance requirements. So again, in addition to the self-study where institutions will consider the standard and the criteria, you should also be mindful of the requirements for federal compliance reporting with the Commission. The support of students toward their educational goals requires a well-organized and appropriate program of student services. Within the scope of the institutional mission, student services can reinforce and extend the college's influence beyond the classroom and promote the comprehensive development of the student. The programs and activities become an integral part of the educational process and help to strengthen learning outcomes. Framed by the institution's mission, student programming and activities should be responsive to the full spectrum of students served, consistent with the institution's mission and goals, and regulated by the same principles and procedures that govern all other programs offered at the college. Institutions should assess these activities and make informed decisions and changes based on that assessment. Third-party providers, those who are contracted by an institution to conduct a significant proportion of activities that become part of the student's educational experience, can be part of an institution's innovative efforts to enhance the student experience. Accredited institutions are expected to conduct appropriate and adequate institutional review and have approval processes in place to ensure that all activities performed in their stead are regularly reviewed and evaluated. This would include any third-party provider activities that impact the student experience. It's worth noting that some contractual agreements with third-party providers require substantive change approval by the Commission. This is usually when an institution has contracted with an unaccredited entity to provide academic programming. These types of agreements, or contracts, are between an accredited institution within the Middle States membership and an unaccredited third party to outsource a portion of the institution's educational programs. The Commission's substantive change policy is triggered when that provider is offering 25% of one or more of the institution's educational programs, leading to an academic or professional degree, certificate, or other recognized educational credential. More information about those types of substantive changes can be found on the Commission's website. However, for those contractual agreements for educational-related services, institutions will be expected to address those within this standard, or within others even if a substantive change request to the Commission was not triggered due to the nature of the agreement. The member institution has not only the contractual obligation, but also systematic processes to ensure its capacity to carry out its responsibility for the oversight of advertising and recruitment, admissions, appointment of faculty, content and rigor of courses or programs, evaluation of student work, awarding of credit and certificate degrees, outcomes assessment, academic advising, support services. Therefore, the self-study may require that institutions address other types of educational services through third-party providers, since every institution is responsible for activities carried out under the institution's name. Even when Commission approval through substantive change procedures is not required for that agreement, the institution, through self-study, will have an opportunity to ensure adequate an appropriate institutional review of third-party provider agreements and activities, including, but not limited to, tutoring, advising, counseling, admission services, recruiting or marketing, international student management, including English as a second language support, and other types of student support services. Services that generally may not fall within the umbrella of educational services could be those such as food or dining services. However, part of your assessment activities may include evaluating and assessing these services, for example, as part of your retention efforts, and may therefore lend to inclusion in the self-study. Throughout this presentation, you have heard questions about the assessment practices as tied to each criterion. With periodic assessment included in every standard, institutional assessment practices continue to be critical. The Commission expects institutions to engage in sound assessment that lends to institutional improvement. The next slide will provide you with basic, key questions relating to assessment within this standard. Again, assessment is embedded within every standard. Key questions regarding the assessment taking place relating to the student experience include: is the process meaningful? To what extent do stakeholders trust what information is in front of them? How well are the assessments directly related to the student experience? Is the process useful? After receiving the assessment information, how engaged are key institutional stakeholders in using the information to enhance the student experience, to consider shifts in services or programs, or other areas that could impact the student experience? What are the ties from the assessment practices to the institutional planning, resource allocation, and institutional effectiveness evaluations? Is the process cost-effective and efficient? Is the process efficient enough to be worth the effort? To what extent has assessment become an ordinary process as opposed to being a burden? Can multiple stakeholders attest to how the assessment process has added value to their professional practice? These are important questions that, when answered, can enable institutions to continuously improve the student experience, ensuring that the institutional support system for students is maximized and sustained over time. Having reviewed all of the criteria, it's important to come back to and reflect upon the language of the standard. These criteria, taken together, specify the characteristics or qualities that encompass Standard 4. Alongside the standard itself, these criteria should be considered holistically within the context of the institutional mission. Remember, the criteria do not represent a checklist. However, they embody the areas that institutions are expected to address within the standard. The language of the standard should not be lost within the criteria, and institutions should demonstrate how they embody the language of the standard, as well as have policies, procedures, or other documentation relating to each criterion. Let's focus on evidence for a moment. This slide provides you with a list of possible policies, procedures, and documentation that institutions may use to demonstrate that they meet the standard. This list does not imply that these are the required documents, nor does this imply that they are the only documents. What the Commission wants to convey is that it will be critically important for the institution to determine what evidence, in the form of policies, procedures, and other documentation, exists at the institution to provide evidence of the effectiveness, institutional improvement, and compliance under this standard. Aligning institutional evidence alongside of each criterion lends to a gap analysis that can be done to determine where resources may need to be developed, better documented, or updated. Current practice and process at the Commission is to capture institutional evidence in what we call a documentation roadmap. This is a template document that provides institutions with a listing of the criteria with each standard, with an accompanying empty box for institutions to fill in with their evidence. It's a document that allows for an institution to conduct a gap analysis quickly and easily, and serves as a tool for gathering evidence. Again, because the criteria are listed along with the requirements of affiliation, this template will promote resource and evidence gathering in an organized and methodical manner designed to support accreditation activities. The documentation roadmap template is available on the Commission's website. The Commission hosts a variety of activities, online and face-to-face, designed to keep you informed about our expectations support the activities of member institutions, and provide you with avenues to collaborate with colleagues across the region. Those include webinars, workshops, training for peer evaluators, as well as our annual conference. If you have ideas about specific opportunities that you would like to see the Commission support, please contact us to let us know. You can find additional information about the Commission through our website, including how to reach staff. If you have any questions about the information presented in this video, please contact your staff liaison at Middle States. Every member institution is assigned a staff liaison. To find who's been assigned to your institution, visit the website and click on Institutions. Find your institution listed and click on Detailed View. Other information about your institution is available through the link Statement of Accreditation Status, which is below the Detailed View link.